So thank you, Dr. Arnold, and welcome everyone. It's lovely to see so many people here. I'm just going to provide a brief snapshot of the current state of homelessness in South Australia with a focus on mental health. For some of you in the audience that work in the homeless sector, this will be very familiar information to you, but for others of you, hopefully it will give you an insight into the levels of homelessness and the vulnerability to homelessness in South Australia, particularly over the last 12 months. So firstly, how do we define and measure homelessness? There are various definitions of homelessness, both internationally and nationally. The cultural definition of homelessness, primary homelessness, secondary homelessness, tertiary homelessness, advanced by Chamberlain and Mackenzie, is the most recognised and widely used definition of homelessness in Australia. However, the official measure of homelessness in Australia is sourced from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, from the census. The ABS definition is based on the understanding that homelessness is a lack of one or more elements that are representative of home: security, stability, privacy, safety, and the ability to control living space. This definition does not include those people who are at risk of homelessness, nor does it include housing situations that put people at risk of homelessness, for example, domestic and family violence, and mental health situations within families that make people vulnerable. Census data provides a point-in-time prevalence measure of selected characteristics of the population, and it's a valuable resource. And stepping away from just talking about homelessness, I just want to make a comment that I'm saddened a little by the negativity about the census that's due to occur next week. Without census data, we wouldn't have an understanding of a lot of the things that have characteristics of people in society and to be able to plan. The census has been a valuable tool over many, many years, for over a century, and so please view it as a valuable resource. On census night 2011, 105,000 people were classified as homeless across Australia. This was an increase of over 17% over the intercensal period. South Australia's population... Oh, hold on, I've gone too far. There we go, sorry. South Australia's population also increased between the 2006 and 2011 census to 5,985 people. Around 38 homeless people per 10,000 of population. Now, this is one of the lowest levels in Australia, but it's still an unacceptable level. In comparing the South Australian population homeless with the total population at the census, in terms of gender, so if we look at the bottom of the table, in terms of gender and age structure, the homeless population in South Australia and in Australia was much the same, with slightly more males than females and with well over half of the population aged under 35. There are fewer Indigenous people affected by homelessness in South Australia, but it must be noted the overrepresentation of the Indigenous population within the homeless population. In terms of housing characteristics, we can see from the table that the majority of homeless people in 2011 were persons living in severely crowded dwellings, followed by supported accommodation, then boarding houses, and living temporarily with others, couch surfing. 6.5% nationally and 4.3% of South Australians were sleeping rough, the most obvious and noticeable form of homelessness to the general public. While the census can provide us with the broad characteristics of the population, it cannot provide us with an insight into other relevant characteristics of the homelessness population, such as the relationship between homelessness and mental health issues, the focus of this conference. Here we turn to the statistics provided by the Specialist Homelessness Services collection available from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. The Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data is collected from all of the states and territories in Australia, collated by the Institute of Health and Welfare and then produced on their website. It's government data, and so the data only collects information from government-funded services. These services are funded by the Council of Australian Government's National Affordability Housing Agreement and the National Partnership Agreement on Homelessness. Homelessness services that do not receive government funding and other non-specialist homelessness services are not included in this national data collection. As the name suggests, all clients of these services are homeless or at risk of homelessness. So the latest available statistics are for the year 2014 to 15, and these indicate that specialist homelessness services provided support Australia-wide to over 255,000 people, an increase of 20,000 people since 2011-12 when this particular data set started. In South Australia, over this period, services have been provided annually to around 21,000 people. Nationally, the characteristics of the clients, the main reasons for seeking assistance and the services provided to clients remain relatively the same over the last 4-year period. However, the noticeable differences are there have been declines in the proportion of males presenting as homeless. There's been a steady increase in the age of clients seeking assistance, and both of these points relate in many respects to the increase of women at the older ages who are becoming homeless for the first time in their life. There's been an increased percentage in clients needing assistance to sustain a tenancy, prevent tenancy failure or eviction. Accommodation has become much more, private rental accommodation has become much more important in housing people, and the proportion of clients at the end of a support period who have received case management support has also increased. So, of importance to this conference is that nationally, the fastest growing client group in the specialist homelessness services population are people with a mental health issue, increasing at an average of 12% per year. In 2014-15, nationally, 25% of all clients had a mental health issue, and in South Australia, this was a little higher at 29% of all clients, or roughly around 6,665 people. Characteristics of people with a mental health issue attending specialist homelessness services in South Australia are representative of the national population with a mental health issue attending the same types of services. But the population with a mental health issue in comparison to all clients attending specialist homelessness services, for example, in the case of South Australia, is different. So 69.4% of total clients, whether you have a mental health issue or not, were aged 18 to 54. But mental health issues tend to occur in the population that's slightly older. So 83.3% of clients in South Australia with a mental health issue were aged 18 to 34. A greater proportion of people with a mental health issue are living in single-person households compared to the total client group. The most common reasons for people with a mental health issue to seek assistance are domestic and family violence and a housing crisis. And in helping these people, these clients generally need longer periods of support compared to the broader specialist homelessness services clients. So a range of services can be identified as needed by clients when they interact with the homelessness service sector. Mental health services, services related to parenting, financial and legal services, disability services, and so on. In terms of housing assistance, this table provides a comparison of clients' needs and the proportion of those needs that were met. This data, the Australian data, is from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare national data set, and the data for South Australia has been kindly provided by Housing SA. Housing SA have an overrider that the data from South Australia is not directly comparable with the official Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data due to differences in counting methodology and definitions used in the extraction of the data. However, I included in the table data for Australia as a whole, as I would hope it provides some indication of how South Australia is tracking in meeting the needs of clients. So in 2014-15, 39% of clients with a mental health issue in South Australia were identified as needing accommodation, compared to 69% for Australia as a whole. The far right-hand column of the table shows that 59% of these clients had their need for accommodation met, though it varied depending on the type of accommodation. What is of importance in particular is access to long-term housing, 5% nationally, but 33% in this state, and also the state's ability to assist people to sustain a tenancy. So we are performing at a better level than national figures suggest, than the national figures indicate for Australia as a whole. This slide shows the outcome for clients in terms of housing when their support period has been closed by the Specialist Homelessness Service. So during the 2014-15 period, at the start of the period, around 44% of clients could be considered homeless, the first 3 bars, and at the end of the period, this had been significantly reduced to just under 19%. Though reduced, still an unacceptable percentage. Those housed in public and community housing increased from 10.6% to 22.2%, and those resident in private rental accommodation increased from 38.5% to 56.7%. So over time, there's been an increasing reliance on private rental accommodation to provide housing for homeless people. So while these outcomes are significant, there is considerable room for improvement as the following, and homelessness reached its crisis points at times, as the following recent newspaper articles highlight, and the very noticeable presence of rough sleepers in the doorways of Adelaide's buildings once the inclement weather conditions set in June and July. So these photos are the orange doorway is at the Target, one of the Target doorway in Rundle Street, Hindley Street, and Faulkner Street, I think. So homelessness was very prevalent when the weather set in terms of rough sleeping. But I think most of those people now have found emergency accommodation and places they can stay. So moving forward, over the last decade and a half, increased policy attention and a formal process of reform to the homelessness sector has significantly benefited clients, with persons in need of assistance better directed as they approach services, and the practice of agencies, including assessments and development of case plans, have delivered better outcomes for families and individuals. However, there is a greater demand for homelessness services than can be met with available resources. The indicators moving forward: ongoing housing affordability issues, difficulties in the private rental market, declines in public and community housing, and increasing waiting lists, depressed state economy, unemployment and the casualisation of the workforce, ongoing social issues such as family breakdown, domestic and family violence, and discrimination in the housing market suggest homelessness and the risk of homelessness will only worsen over the coming decade. While we see stable, secure housing as an essential basis upon which to receive services to improve wellbeing, as the Minister outlined, this diagram outlines annual spending on government services. The far bar to the right, the black strip, is the amount of money that is spent on housing and homelessness programs, a small, very small proportion of the national government budget, just $4.3 billion. And as the Minister indicated, even this amount of spending is under threat. Beyond to June 2017, there is no money moving forward in the estimates of the budget for funding of homelessness services, a similar situation that occurred prior to the signing of the present agreement between the national government and the states and territory governments. Such uncertainty around funding creates a range of issues for the state government: the viability of services, the retention of staff, and the need of a needed and valuable sector for homeless people or people at risk of homelessness. And it was wonderful to hear the Minister say that she's pushing for a 5-year agreement. But homelessness is not just a housing issue. It intersects with so many other domains, including health, physical, mental, psychiatric, disability, policing, education, employment, indigeneity, and domestic violence. I'll finish my talk with a question for today's conference. Is the growth in the number and proportion of clients with an identified mental health issue, that growth of 12% per annum, just a case of increased awareness, identification and reporting of mental illness among clients, or are there other factors at play? Thank you.